For a little bit more on this, we're now joined by founder and managing director of the Joseph Movement, NPC, and also a spokesperson for the National Freedom Network, Tersia De Klerk. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. It's hard to imagine that in the 21st century that people are still being trafficked. Just how big is the problem?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I think that the problem is actually much wider than one would expect. From what we know in South Africa, approximately 155,000 people are trapped at any given time in human trafficking situations within South Africa. And then globally, we're looking at approximately 50 million people. Now, when we talk about these figures, we're not saying that 50 million people have gone missing. We are saying that the biggest percentage of those people are actually right under our noses. And we need to understand that human trafficking is not only abduction and kidnapping. It is so much wider than that. There are so many faces of human trafficking. As we know, we've got labor trafficking and sex trafficking. However, there are many other faces, such as forced begging, there is a forced marriage, there's forced illegal activity, and horrific things such as baby harvesting and organ harvesting. So all of that is taken into account when we talk about these figures.
How is it able to thrive and survive this trafficking? Are we not able to see what's happening? Is it so well hidden? Is it very sophisticated? How does it happen?
That is the sad thing about human trafficking, Peter, is that it is actually a hidden crime. That is one of the biggest challenges that we have around human trafficking, because it's often overshadowed by other crimes, such as, for instance, the drug trade. We have found that in many cases, there would be, for instance, a drug bust, and then that is the focus. People are then taken into custody, locked up for drug trafficking. But in the meantime, many of those so-called perpetrators are actually victims of human trafficking. For instance, in the sex trafficking industry, many of those people that are trapped in the sex trafficking industry actually fall victim to substance abuse. And that is a modern day shackle, if you want to call it that. So the shackles of modern day slavery nowadays is fear. It is making people reliant on substance abuse, for instance. And then also, when we look at the children, many of the children do not realize that when they become a victim of trafficking, especially within the sex trafficking field, for instance, those children often believe that they are to blame, and they live in fear. So fear plays a very big role. And of course, corruption, unfortunately, has been fueling human trafficking within South Africa.
One would say that women and children are perhaps more vulnerable than men. How do adult males, get caught up in labor trafficking? What happens typically?
The sad thing about labor trafficking is so many of the victims are desperate for a better future and desperate to, being able to provide for themselves and to provide for their families. And what we find is that when it comes to cross-border trafficking, whether it's coming into our country or exiting our country, those people are going or coming with the hope of a better future. And what we have picked up in the past few years is that the number one form of tricking victims into trafficking is fake job offers. And that is just becoming extremely prevalent. Also with the use of technology and of course, social media, it is so easy to trap people into a fake job offer. And what we are finding is so many foreigners are even lured into our country with the hope of a better future, maybe coming from a war-torn area or an impoverished area or country, coming to South Africa with high hopes. And then when they come into the country, the traffickers actually remove their identification documents. They are threatened, either with authorities for being a so-called illegal immigrant, and even their lives and the lives of their families are threatened. So it's unfortunately one of the things that fuel human trafficking when it comes to labor trafficking specifically. It's just that hope of a better future. And we have seen that when we look at the United States or the United Nations GLOTIP report, that globally, the statistics show that 38% of labor trafficking victims are men. And that is why we really always emphasize, sex trafficking is so real. And the most vulnerable are definitely our children and our women, but we can't forget the men, because when it comes to labor trafficking specifically, they take the biggest chunk of the victim percentage, which is 38%.
What can be done? I get a sense that some of this is actually happening right under our noses, and we may be meeting people who are actually in captivity. Are there telltale signs? What can we do?
Yes, so Peter, there are telltale signs. Sometimes they are a little bit more difficult to identify. However, if we just take the time, when we go into a mall or into a shop, we find that there are many popular shops that we actually go into where there are labor trafficked victims, mostly foreigners, of course. And it's just a case of taking the time and to converse a bit more with that person. We find that in many cases, they don't have, any identification documents. Sometimes they even seem to follow a script when you speak to them, or there might be someone by their side or behind them or within the vicinity that tend to speak on their behalf. In many cases, you can also see that the person is maybe, not that eloquent, and they don't necessarily know the area in which they are at that moment, the area they maybe work in, they don't really know the area, or they are very vague in where they come from, where their family is. So those are some of the signs that one can look out for. But the problem with these is that you have to take the time to just, ask a few questions and just be a little bit more interested in the people that you converse with, whether it's in a shopping mall or on the street or even a person begging, which I think many of us are very guilty of, trying to ignore beggars. But we have seen that there is a rampant growth in forced begging as well within South Africa. So just taking the time to communicate a little bit and keep our eyes open. And if there's anything that we are suspicious about, we have the National Human Trafficking Hotline. South Africa has a hotline that is run extremely well, and it was established by A21 as well. And there are many stakeholders that are involved in this hotline. And one can simply report, any suspicious situation. And if you are wrong, it's okay. But if you are correct in your suspicions, you can possibly save a life or save multiple lives. So I just would like to share that number if you don't mind.
Yes, yes, Tersia.
It's 0800 222 777. That's a number like 10111 that everyone should memorize and have saved on their phones. It's a toll-free number, and you can phone that number anonymously as well. So it's 0800 222 777. Even if you find yourself in a possible human trafficking situation, you can phone that number. Or if you're suspicious of any activity down your road or any building or house, phone that number. Those people who answer the calls are well trained. They know what questions to ask, and they can identify a true human trafficking situation or victim.
Tersia, great talking to you. Thank you so much for highlighting this problem. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Peter.
That's Tersia De Klerk talking to us about human trafficking, which sadly is a problem that continues to plague us, and one that we should all be mindful of. Stay with us. You're watching The Globe.